I'm just really delighted that he was in the States and that I could convince him to come to this part of the country before he goes back to England on a Saturday. So just wanted to introduce him, and I know talking about making modern memory is really about storytelling as well, so I'll let him
There'll be some stories.
a deeper moment on that.
And I still wanted to say thank you, Tara, for organizing this event for our History, Memory and Conflict program. We really, I'm Karina Karasterina.
Yes, hello, Karina. Yeah.
Program of this.
Yes, I read the information.
Yeah,
fascinating.
so we are really glad to host you here for this our program.
Thank you. Where to begin? Your elevator is interesting, actually. If you press the G, I thought that meant ground, but actually you go underground. And as I sailed underground, I thought there must be a metaphor here. A metaphor for pushing ground and getting underground. In other words, memory and but memory and identity. In other words, if you press the sort of the ground button, Grund button, you actually have to go underground.
And different meanings of G.
Yeah.
So I guess that's really what I'm playing with. It's not a game for me because I take it very seriously, but let's call it play between different kinds of identities, mine and others, but over periods of time. Different kinds of identity, mine and others, over a period of time, and how those interact and intersect, and with a body of work, because I realized that I was engaging with a body of work, but it was not called a body of work. There's an it out there that I'm really interested in. I'm trying to write a book about it. And I use the title of this, Inventing Modern Memory, but actually I don't think it is invented. I think it's been made and constructed and discovered, really, reassembled maybe. I'm not sure whether it's exactly modern, but it's certainly, I think, 20th century. And it isn't necessarily, I think it is authentic, but it isn't necessarily directly memory in the sense of personal memory. And what I have interpreted in it, and I'll say a few autobiographical things to show how I got there, is that one can sort map an alternative way of doing memory. I won't call it memory work because that's something specific, I think, to the 90s and early 2000s, that has been culturally created in response to other things, and it is different from the kind of memory that most memory scholars were studying after the Yugoslav wars in former Yugoslavia and Chechnya and all the rest of it, and after the 89 nationalisms came up, when a lot of it was on the imagined community of the nation. I'm not particularly interested in that, and that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking, I'm not in that sense necessarily talking about a simple collective memory. I think I'm talking more about something in cultural history. But I'm using the word invention in the title in the way that Terence Ranger and Eric Hobsbawm used the title in Inventing Tradition. Because I think there is something there that you can put a framework on by looking back at things. And partly it's me looking back at my life, partly looking back at certain historical and cultural experiences and beginning to see something that is there, and which I think can be interpreted, this is why I think it's relevant to peace research and to post-conflict cultural analysis, is that there's something there which deals with trauma in a redemptive and transnational, transcendent way. So in other words, the memory that I'm looking at is if you like, a demilitarizing memory. It's a memory that comes out of a century of total violence, of Holocaust and war, and yet it is not locked into that. It goes beyond it. And it stems from certain kinds of personal experience, and I could talk a little bit about my own because it's one of the ways I got into it, but also cultural production. In other words, crucial to this has been the making of movies, the writing of poetry, the creation of plays, writing of novels, and other kinds of creative enterprise in which, even though very unconsciously, a memory of an event or a series of events or the reaction to an event is central. So that's the kind of, in quotes, modern, in quotes, memory and making, constructing that I'm really interested in, fascinated in actually, obsessed by. In fact, had it not been that I was stuck editing an encyclopedia for 7 years, I would have been working on this, from early 2000s. So it's been a postponed joy in a way to get into this and to also to engage with people like yourselves who are involved in memory work and interact and hear about your research and how it may inform or interact with what I'm trying to do. So I'm very interested in engaging in other people's memory work, other kinds of scholarship, looking at memory as opposed to history, as opposed to the archive, the experiential, the narrative, and so on. Okay, so back to moi. I think probably, but this is all again putting things back, going back to that Proustian moment or that Freudian moment or that, I don't think there were Halbaxian moments, but certainly going back to that way in which memory was functionally used at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, in terms of particular kinds of inquiry. Freud, Proust in a literary way about the relevance of past and social status and all that stuff, and then Halbach's trying to introduce it as a sociological, unsuccessfully I would say, as a sociological concept, and then moving on to the post 1918, but I'll get back to that. So in other words, trying to see how the memory that I had of World War II, growing up as a child in the early 1940s in London, which wasn't a good place to be, how that later was reinterpreted in terms of my own life and my own experience, what it meant. I didn't feel it as a trauma at the time, but it was. I mean, my house was destroyed by a bomb, and a lot of relatives were killed, and da-da-da-da. Usual story. It didn't feel traumatic, but then it never does it? That's normality. But I think reflecting on that has been a very important stimulus in the reflections I had. I think that the next period that was important for me in terms of putting together this puzzle was the cultural experience of the 1960s, when a number of things began to come together. But I wasn't thinking modern memory. What we were thinking about was discovering the Holocaust, reflecting on, first of all, the war that we had lived through, but also the war that our grandparents perhaps had lived through, the Great War, 1914-18, and seeing parallels with the kind of construction that the Great War was, attrition, mutual assured destruction, with the nuclear arms race, which by the late 1950s was beginning to take off in the Dr. Strangelove syndrome of great powers being about to obliterate each other with nuclear weapons, and it was a very real fear. And so those parallels, and the parallels again with the Central European Holocaust of mainly Jews, were things that we were trying to put together with the bombing of our own cities in Germany, in Holland, in England, and other places. So that was the kind of wrap. And being involved with issues of nuclear weapons, being involved with the process of looking at really redoing history, because this was a period when new kinds of history, late Marxist history, new kinds of social interpretive history, kind of work that Edward Thompson was doing, for example, the making of the English working class. That was the kind of work that was coming through in that period, associated with the New Left, I suppose, the intellectual New Left in England rather than the American New Left, perhaps. But Staunton Lind and others were doing similar kinds of history here. So in the 60s, we were looking at that kind of mix of how these things interacted and the memories and how they were dealt with culturally. Oh, what a lovely war. Alain René's work, Nuit et Brouillard, Night and Fog, and Hiroshima Mon Amour, where the juxtaposition of memory and personal identity and place became essential. That wonderful script by Marguerite Duras in Hiroshima Mon Amour, where you get that use of flashback, where she is trying to interpret Hiroshima through her lover, and he's saying, no, you never can do that. You have to go back to your own memory, your own trauma. And then we get the flashback to her collaborationist love affair in occupied France. Extraordinary memory piece, that is, I think. And then again, Night and Fog, when Renee takes us to Auschwitz and we see it in the coloured postcard, and then the flip back to the black and white images of 1942, 3, 4. And so there was a lot of churning on, and that was a time when those of us involved in those kinds of political movements were also, in a sense, looking at cultural production that related to that. And I think we weren't really aware of how it all fitted together. I'm not sure that we still are. But there was, what I'm trying to do is to kind of create a kind of map of these things and look at the interrelationship. How does Virginia Woolf's concern with memory relate with, say, Benjamin or even T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland? You know, how do those responses to memory and modernity, how do they interrelate with one another? They're obviously about personal crisis, but they're also about an existential experience of the world as it was, in that interruption of the two wars of 1914 and 1939. So that unraveling that, was really important for me. But I was also doing other things. I was going to graduate school and learning theory, being very much involved in political peace work, and starting the peace research movement, and a lot of other things. So there it was, that thing happened to me in the 60s, and it was very important, I realized, and we went into a lot of other sort of lateral inquiries into memory in film and in poetry. A lot of the poetry of the trenches has that memory dimension, looking back and capturing moments and reflecting on moments, not necessarily moments in the war, moments outside the war. So then move on, and we then get to 1980s, and I'm teaching a course in a Peace Studies program in New York, and it's on images of war and peace in modern art, film and literature. And of course, hey presto, we're back in memory again. We're back, all the documents that I'm beginning to use, the books, the films, the novels, the poetry, you name it, and including the new production, is wrapped around this issue of cultural memory. And of course, the book that came out in the mid-70s, which I think turns out to be far more seminal than he would ever have anticipated, and far more important, I think, for me, in identifying modern memory, was Paul Fussell's book, The Great War in Modern Memory. And as I say, I'm sure that title was probably even just thought up by the publisher. It didn't have the kind of depth of meaning that I think perhaps it does now in retrospect. I don't think Paul Fussell was really the great... he went places and didn't know where he was going, and so, but we can travel that journey, I think, and go much further. In fact, many people have, and not always perhaps recognizing what a breakthrough that was. I was teaching a course at Colgate with Terence Dupre, who wrote a book on post-Holocaust memory, The Survivor, and one or two others, and we had a lot of visiting people coming in. Robert J. Lifton, who'd done a lot on Hiroshima memory, for example, and Holocaust memory, and a number of really very extraordinary people came to that class and joined us, and so on. I then decided to run a study group to Europe and to take students in a junior semester abroad to sites of memory in Europe. And as we did that, this project began to sort of grow and grow and grow, and I realized that I need to do a little bit more than teach about it and play with it. I needed actually to sort of think more seriously and systematically about it. And at that time, and of course there were people who were beginning to publish and to do things. I think the first was Modris Eckstein's with his book Rites of Spring. And who else? It was interesting how many of them were Americans, even though the subject matter was pretty solidly European or Japanese. But Jay Winter, there was a whole range of people who were involved at that time. But a lot of literature obviously coming out by then. But something happened, I think, to the memory work business. And that is because of the traumas of the Balkans in particular. And that a new generation of young scholars were emerging from the former Soviet republics or from East and Central Europe and from the former Yugoslavia, that the and also in post-colonial situations, the focus shifted back to post-trauma memory in relationship to those experiences. And so it was relocated from the kinds of things that I remain interested in, which have to do with a European experience, a larger European experience over a very long period of time, back to the specific question of ethnic identity and memory and national stories and myth-making. As I say, that is not what I'm really interested in. I'm much more interested in the kind of memory actually which replaces that imagined community by a different imagined community that actually bonds across those barriers and frontiers. That it's, in other words, dare I say, a peace memory, but at least a redemptive and transcendent or trans-border kind of memory work. And that's where I'm sort of at. Obviously, I've been informed a great deal by what I've read, including by some of you around here, I'm sure, but also Pierre Nora, and the discovery of the work of W.G. Sebald, who himself, I think, wrestled with trying to deal with something in the abstract, but yet was deeply personal. In other words, the experience of the Holocaust, although he wasn't a Jew, and the experience of the destruction of German cities, which he was not old enough to remember. He was younger than I am. I think Sebald's work is also, is a new marker in the evolution of this kind of memory construction or memory work or making modern memory. But I think a lot has to be done, and this is where I want to open it up and share with you and hear your interactions and your perspectives. I think a lot has to be done in seeing these relationships over time, relationships between cultures, because each European experience is unique, is different. It isn't just one common memory, although I think there are common works, and there's certain things which really do cross the boundaries. I don't know. Let's take one. Jay Winter picks Katie Kolwitz's sculpture of the grieving parents in Wrocław by the grave of their son Peter as one of those. And clearly that is not German, and it isn't Belgian, and it isn't anything except it is a very universal kind of statement. And I think those kinds of things, or Benjamin's image of the angel history and the Paul Klee, those kinds of things aren't peculiar to one national memory. I think Pierre Nora has been unfairly criticized for making his memory concept too national. I don't agree. I think his theory can be taken right across the board. I don't think it's French. It is French in one sense. It's part of a French intellectual tradition. But his examples are French because that's what he knows. But he is very clear, I think, that this is about something that's much more universal, that's much more, cross-border and beyond Europe even, that it is something here that is truly different. So I think that I admire his theoretical take on all of this, and I think it's extremely useful. One more to say. Probably I should shut up and we should get on with some dialogue, and I can catch my breath and have a sip of water. But it would be very good to hear, where your own work that relates to this is going, and what kind of collaborative opportunities there may be. So, Karina, perhaps we should start with you, since you're running this wonderful project.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Especially if we speak regarding one overarching idea which unites a lot of students here based on what they choose to do for their PhD work, for their thesis work. It's a role of memory in nation building, and not just development of national identity by developing different meanings of what nation is. And I believe that, again, if we speak about the whole development, you speak a lot about memory work, how Holocaust was developed in the 1960s. Alexander writing a lot about this development of the sacred evil idea of Holocaust. And what we see in many places around the world, Borislava is doing work in Croatia and around the Balkan War and others, how they represented in history, we really see that every single dominant narrative in society employ a lot of this memory to justify current structure of power in society. And I think this what could be very interesting, what we are trying to explore together as our group. Exactly, we really link it more to conflict because it's important for us. So how this structure of power leads to direct violence or to structural violence, how memory is used to justify particular structures of this.
No, I understand that, Karina, but what I'm actually suggesting is that there is a counter memory that the Virginia Woolfs and even the Ernest Hemingway, for example, are creating a counter memory, a counter gestalt, if you like, that's different from the archive. In that sense, is different from history.
It's exactly.
And is much more universal.
Exactly. I just did research in Ukraine. I'm going back in December to do it, and I was able to identify 6 major narratives in Ukraine. Each of them, central part of each of them is a memory, mostly World War II. And each of them have what you called counter memory. Each of them has completely their own interpretation of what happens during World War II. And it's not like counter memory against archival work, because there are no, this is about meaning making, because there is no there is no truth what happened during World War II. Everyone believes that their version was the truth. There are several types of history textbook in Ukraine which produce completely different memory, or what you call official narrative. There are even contradictions between official narratives. In some countries, we know that in Europe, only 2 countries which do not really control their history education, Sweden and Norway. All other countries do control their history education, so there are some dominant narratives, but really multi-perspectivity taking over Europe and here in the United States. So we're speaking about, in UK, one of the leading in this multi-perspectivity type. So I don't believe just in counter-narrative. I believe in multiple counter-narratives. Each of them has their own, what I want to say is that counter-narrative does not start in the past. Counter-narrative start in even future. So what we want to achieve and how this counter-narrative can help us to achieve what we want to do.
But it seems to me that the kind of counter-narrative that I'm talking about, it has emerged outside formal structures of education, formal institutions, outside the state. In fact, it's in that sense, it is very anti-archive, anti-history, in state history, and that it has been sustained. I mean, give an example of amazing popularity of the play and musical play War Horse, which I know is got top Broadway thing and so on. How many people have seen War Horse? Anybody been to it? It's marvelous. But it started out as a children's book. Not a children's book that was taught in schools, although actually schools did begin to take it up, but it's a book just kids like to read Michael Morpurgo's books. And he dealt with trauma, but in a way in which was, again, very redemptive. And this story of the little boy with the horse in growing up and then going into the Great War is magical. And it's moving, but it's very different from the kind of nationalist history. It depicts Germans and French and Belgian and English interacting in the course of the play, and it's very, in the end, empowering, sad but empowering. And I think that's the kind of contemporary example I would think, whereby this, and then people take it up and say, well, you know, this must be done. People take schools to it, take kids to it, and it generates an interest. Because it's a work, you know, it's a very successful work of art.
You know, but you speak about it, and please, everyone, it's just like idea. I know it's crazy idea, but I love crazy ideas. Sometimes they help. Idea about the whole scholarship about social movement, because what you're talking about by creating this book and then have supporters of people who love the book, who transfer the book to others, so it's exactly how we can describe social movement and social mobilization around some alternative or counter-narrative, how you call them. Yes, and I completely agree with you when you speak about it. It's not just, it's definitely not coming from the official part. It's definitely produced from this society.
So we'll stop this duologue and ask for some more
So most of the examples that you gave spontaneously of these counter memories, strikingly to me, came from the arts or from artists, whether it was Klee or Szabo or Hesse or Hemingway. And so I wonder the extent to which you can name counter memories that are not part of an aesthetic world, that maybe what you're talking about is an aesthetic theory of memories. And maybe you're really talking about what one of the functions of art is to push against the archives.
Well, absolutely, yeah.
And in fact, that's one of the reasons why in certain kinds of regimes you need a Ministry of Culture or a Zhdanov to control that very, very powerful impulse of the arts to escape the archives and to go out into the world with a counter memory. So it seems to me like you're moving in the direction of an aesthetics and not so much in politics.
Well, yes, I agree, and it's interesting because my editor said, well, I don't see the politics here. And I think the link is exactly...
I'm cursed with the editor's eye. One of my many curses.
And I say, well, you know, sometimes the soft politics is the good one, the one that you don't notice, it creeps up on you. And that's where the idea of the social movement is right, because I think that social movements need their mythologies. I don't mean that in a negative sense, to see what kind of framework they're operating within. And I think all major social movements, you know, build their culture, build their memories around it. The civil rights movement or whatever, that they have that, they have their culture. But it isn't just an elite literary culture. And after all, I mean, Hemingway's Soldier's Home is not elite literature. I mean, yeah, Eliot, sure, but yeah, but we, you know, but that I don't see him as particularly central. I just mentioned him because the different kinds of way in which memory was, you know, the ramifications of memory in that major post-1918 period. But I think that, so if you think of kind of a social movement growing with its beginning to have its identity, I wrote actually an article recently was rejected because the editor said, we don't think movements can have an identity. And I said, okay.
Which is about the affirmation of identity. Yeah.
So, okay, well, I'm not going to argue that one, you know. But in other
Rena
words...
will argue it for you.
I'm sure, well, right, okay, so find me another magazine. But what this is doing is taking what, in a sense, is in quotes high culture and broadening it down so that it becomes a framework, an understanding, a map which people can follow at every level, from my 9-year-old grandson through to, you know, people who are getting involved in the Occupy movement to whatever. But there's a kind of trajectory there, particularly I think for the peace movement and for peace research, which you think on the whole is very acultural, you know. My criticism of my colleagues and friends is that they don't see where it fits.
Yeah.
I have a journal for you, Social Change, with editor Rabi. He will love this. But excuse me for my ignorance, I really just heard yesterday at the conference, was whole day conference, and I didn't write the name of the book, but there is a book now in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, very popular there, about some like women something, and book was so influential that now the fertility among women dropped for 30%. I was just told that this book was I have to do some more research because it was just told by some person, but it's exactly what you are talking about. Then some book can be so influential that it starts a whole social movement. The same was in Ukraine. They had, it's different little, but maybe interesting. The several stories were published about orphanage, and now there's a huge movement in Ukraine without orphanage, and it's become social movement. People adopting orphans in order to like make this new image of Ukraine, which came from these several articles which were published, like not articles but like stories, literary stories. So it can be extremely powerful when particular ideas and values which where state, what is really interesting, this is spaces where state does not produce any influence, or influence of state requires some alternation. When we speak about this counter narrative.
Right. I mean, I think another, just to sort of slightly shift a little bit, another issue that's really come up recently is the whole question of whether what we're really talking about is a common European memory. And I would be a little bit uncomfortable about pigeonholing it in terms of that, because it's, first of all, I mean, as you say, there are a lot of European memories, but also because I think this is not just located in Europe. I think it is about, it's mostly, I think, modern industrial societies, but it's also about, I think, American memory. You know, even though some of this trauma was delayed, as it were, to 1917 or 1942, nevertheless, I think it's there, and I think that the American contribution, cultural contribution, is enormous. And that interaction with it has gone on. I mean, even those people who are not American, I think like Peter Watkins' film The Journey, that amazing 14-hour film that he made, is so much about locked into a series of memories, and it I think could not exist without a body of work which came before, which, you know, was particularly from North America. So I think that there's a problem in thinking of this as just a kind of, if you like, a European cultural memory. I think that's, even though perhaps some of the greatest traumas, except for the bombing of Japanese cities, but maybe the conference on European memory in the spring, early spring. I'm still thinking about how I will relate to that, you know, and I think that's another thing to throw out and get comment on, because several of you are from that side of the Atlantic.
One more observation, and that is that I think probably the most faithful and potent memory work today, to decenter it from Europe entirely, is in China. Mm-hmm. Because you think about the traumas of Europe, yeah, but really in that part of the world, it's the traumas of China. Yeah. And what has replaced, to the extent that it ever was a believable ideology, Marxism, Leninism, or Maoism, is this whole notion of the century of humiliation that we suffered from the Opium Wars onward. Mm-hmm. And it very much, of course, reverses the Hiroshima Mon Amour, in which the great victim was Japan and Nagasaki and Hiroshima, because from the Sino point of view, the great victimizer is Japan, and that's a yeah, narrative too in the Philippines to some extent, yeah, and in Southeast Asia, yeah, to some extent. But it is in China where memory is being harnessed most powerfully in a national narrative. And I think that it's useful sometimes to decenter us, yes, from Europe and from the Second World War, yeah, and mid-century, yeah, as seen from Europe, because from China's point of view, 1934, Manchuria, that's where modern history begins. Yeah.
It's interesting you should say that, actually, because a Chinese student who did this class that I mentioned earlier did a wonderful project on Nanjing as a memory. And you know, one template for looking at the changes in all of this is that the Japanese peace museums now are depicting the Imperial Pacific War and what happened to people in the Philippines and what happened to people in Manchuria and so on and other places. They're beginning to tell that sort of the non-victim side of the Japanese story, which, you know, again is, I think, part of that transcendence of the victimhood thing, the victim
distance
memory.
From a museum installation to a junior high school textbook
Yeah.
is like the distance from here to another galaxy, socialism.
Yeah, it is, but you know, and this is where I would say that maybe British education isn't quite as bad as you think, because it does actually lead to a lot of English kids going out to the sites of the things they're reading about in Flanders and sometimes wherever. And so there is that kind of ability to go from, if you like, the textbook to beyond the museum, because I think the new museum is no longer, the old sort of dusty thing of the past. It's something which is much more vibrant. The Flanders Fields Museum in Belgium, which I recommend to anybody who's that side of La Manche, is really extraordinary, because it's actually about civilians, it's about nurses, it's about Chinese, 250,000 Chinese laborers working in the area digging trenches. It's extraordinarily universalistic in its approach to what happened there in 1914, 18 and beyond. And
the most powerful anti-war installation that I ever saw, I saw at the Imperial War Museum. There were two.
There's some good ones, yes.
There were two. One was they recreated a World War I trench.
Yep.
And the other was
the Blitz.
The Blitz.
Which I lived through.
That's
Survived.
Right. That's right.
And again, a thing that students from 9 years old to 25 really appreciate, actually. So that's the kind of way in which a museum can do that.
One walks out and sees the Spitfire and the Hurricane.
I know, and the big Jutland guns outside as well. And of course, that building was a madhouse, don't you?
I do.
Where is that?
In London.
Bedlam, Bethlehem Hospital. It was a lunatic asylum, which they turned into a war museum, and which George V, when he owned it, said this is the museum to show people that we should never have war again. People forget that. It was actually intended to be a kind of a peace thing, and then,
Another example.
So was the field of international relations, is that right?
Yeah, another example is a museum in Richmond, of Civic War Museum, and they have alternative narratives, like South and North narratives represented for mostly every single exhibition. So it's more memorable for people who are coming there, see that there are still in US there are still no common narrative about what happens during the Civic War.
Great. Yes.
Anyway, Karina was just talking about the role of the use of memory in justifying certain power structures, and also, it's not unrelated, is sort of the issue of denial and memory and narrative in terms of like guilt and shame, and sort of the hunger for victims to have an accurate recording of history and the denial of that. And there was a conference that you had last year, and there was another one. There are a few conferences that have been dealing like how to deal with the shameful past.
A lot of the literature that I've been looking at has focused on that, and I appreciate its importance, particularly in terms of a conflict resolution center. But I think there is something else out there as well that gets lost a little bit in the truth and reconciliation framework or these other things. In other words, I think rather than this sort of question of what tends to be often a dualistic, victim executioner model, that you get outside that and you actually look at institutional structures in the way that it has many victims. War as an institutional social injustice, in the way in which it conscripts, did conscript in 100 different countries, usually the unwilling, usually the disadvantaged, use them in a very careless way in war, and in all the other social injustices which spring from that hierarchical organization of violence. Now that's a very different kind of thing to think about, and yet it's had tens of millions of direct victims and hundreds of millions of indirect victims in terms of structural violence and disease and famine and all the rest of it. So I think that, whilst I'm not denigrating the narrative and the kind of thing that you're talking about, I think maybe it over-dominated the field of memory work in the 90s and early 2000s. And so my work is a little bit controversial in that way. I'm suggesting that we actually relocate the center of interest a little bit away from the kind of thing that is so richly covered in the literature. But I think almost you know, it can be over. You can go on duplicating these kinds of study, but I wonder where it's leading to. I don't see the larger framework, and I suppose that's a slight problem for me. But so I'm suggesting maybe we just shift across laterally.
I think this is interesting, and I take a little bit of issue with the comment that Kevin and your editor made about it being more of an aesthetic thing and not a politics thing, because I see the two really very much linked, that aesthetics are politics. And that may be a bit of my own experience growing up and hearing of my family and people who fought in the resistance against Nazis were artists, and all my Czech relatives talk about when they talk about the Velvet Revolution, they talk about the aesthetic elements of it, and they don't talk about much of the larger things. They're kind of tangentially related, but it starts with this aesthetic piece, or this, you know, the songs or other type of. It's all that aesthetic that is the politics.
Absolutely.
And so my work has been mostly on the aesthetic, political, social movement area. So I would push back against any notion that something is aesthetic and not politic.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've written a book on the '60s, which I was very active in terms of the political movements there. And without the music, without the art, without the alternative newspapers, without all the other movies that we made and all the other things, it wouldn't have had that kind of power. It wouldn't have had the kind of impact that it had. That was essential to it. And I think the problem with quite a few of the movements that have exceeded it, you know, is that culture wasn't there. I think one of the tragedies of '89 in Europe was that there was building in Central Europe and Eastern Europe an alternative culture, but it got buried in the political, because of the end of the Cold War and all the political deals that were done. It somehow got buried, and with it many of the great individuals who were involved in what was a cultural movement, I think, in Poland, in East Germany, in Hungary and other places. It got buried in the politics. It got buried in the big power deals. It got buried in a lot of other stuff. And of course, then attention turned to the tragic falling apart of Yugoslavia. So, in a way, that, you know, it lost. Just as I think that, in fact, 60s culture went sour by the end of the 60s because of that implosion into violence and self-destructive kind of activity. But it was nevertheless, the cultural impact of it is undeniable, and the cultural legacy, when you think about what was produced from, say, 58 to 68, amazing 10 years, you know, creatively, and even some of the things that came later owed their origin to the inspiration of those years. So I think, I mean, I agree completely that, you know, that the cultural revolution is very much part of it. Something that I think that probably people do understand, a lot of people your age understand, that's essential. Tricky, but essential. Well, very nice to be here, and start to get to know some of you. And I'm going to be around for another half hour or so. So if any of you aren't rushing after classes or other things, you know, I'd be happy to chat.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for coming and speaking to us, because it's always interesting to see different views. It's, again, multi-perspectivity helping us to understand what we are doing.
Good, nice to meet you.
I was wondering, Nigel, if you could talk a little bit more about the Balkans Peace Park you're involved in, and how peace parks in these transboundary areas are making a different space for memory.
That's interesting. I mean, I hadn't thought of it really in terms of memory, although memory is important in terms of the individuals who interact with one another there. It's getting beyond memories of a fragmented political situation dominated, I think, by conflict, dominated often by large powers, by war, and focusing on, first of all, just having a decent life. I mean, you know, just the usual things that one needs in terms of a secure existence, and schools and doctors and those sorts of things. Secondly, in terms of preserving what is wonderful about that part of the Balkans, which is the landscape, which is up there with, you know, I managed to spend a day in Yosemite a couple of weeks ago, and it immediately reminded me of northern Albania. It is stunning, you know, it is wonderful mountain scenery, And culturally amazing too, I mean, in terms of the stone houses and all the rest of it. And it's very rich culturally. I mean, it has, you know, the three religions, Orthodox, Muslim, and Catholic. It has, you know, different minorities as well as the Slav populations, the Albanian populations, and so on. It has other minorities there. So it's a fascinating mosaic ethnically. And those borders were very artificial. I mean, you know, most borders are, of course, but as we all know. But these were particularly harsh because they left half the Albanians outside Albania. That's the 1912 London Agreement. And so that was going to always create problems, you know, in Macedonia, in Serbia, in Kosovo, in Montenegro. And it has. So the Peace Park is a symbol of bringing those people and that landscape back together. And yes, creating a space in which you can get beyond that past, the past of a very repressive regime in Albania under Hoxha, the past of the great empires, the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman empires, of Russian influence, which was immense, and beginning to create a new identity. And of course, ironically, the one thing that unites everybody in that region is wanting to be part of Europe. So, you know, getting memories that, in some sense, allow you to go into that space means that you have to think of some other things than the things that maybe you've been brought up to think about. And that is always very, very tricky in any culture, going beyond the trauma and into a narrative that is, in a sense, a Balkan narrative in Europe, or, you know, and not just a South Slav narrative, but a Balkan narrative in Europe, and that is, I think, is happening. And little things like the Peace Park project across those three borders, which has historical roots in trade and in cultural interaction, and many political movements crossed from Pristina to Shkodra and to Podgorica and so on. So that it does have a past, and it is building up that alternative past, an alternative history as well as memory, perhaps.
Right.
But yes, if anybody's interested, you know, you can get the website from Tara, and it's going well. And it's a very international boat, because not only we do have the various groups from the region involved, but also people from across Europe and North America involved as well. We have international volunteers going there for 6 weeks every summer to teach English, to do environmental work, to just help with, you know, mending a bridge, or just actually hanging out and saying, you know, we're concerned and we're working with you and we love where you live, and that kind of just respect and involvement is really very, very important. And there's a new kind of morale in the 10 years that I've been going there, or more than that now. But you've seen a change, and in fact, it's reflected in the people are returning to the villages. They're rebuilding the old family homes. They're beginning to till the fields and the gardens again. So it's extraordinary actually to see that happening, but it's rewarding.
Actually, I have an interesting question about this. You spoke about these common European memories, and what do you think? Because one of the major dilemmas is exactly when European Union was developed. One of the major goals of European Union was to preserve European history and culture and everything. Mm. But since this more than 20 years, the level of immigration increased significantly. How do you think this dilemma can be resolved? Because from one side, European idea is to preserve European history and memory. From the other side is how to incorporate all these histories and memories of immigrants which are coming into Europe, which become more and more significant. Because you speak about this conference on common European memory. So how do you see this dilemma?
You mean like people coming from North Africa?
Yeah, from North Africa, from Muslim countries.
Yeah. Well, perhaps by making that European memory clearly a universalistic memory. And I think for those socialists and other feminists and others who did work across those, it was a universal idea. And I think that's the focus, actually, which is why the peace movement and peace culture is relevant. because it's that is open to, that doesn't stop, at the Mediterranean. It doesn't stop at the Bosphorus. It doesn't, stop at, on the coast of Ireland. It is, and you all come, it's come join that universal
But
celebration,
the issue
which was supposed to be the American idea, if you remember.
Yeah, but the issue is that for universalistic memory, it's a great idea, and I completely support it. But just to play this devil
Advocate.
yes,
Yeah.
it possesses a lot of threat for specific identities. Like, for example, Danish people really feel a lot of threat
Yeah.
right now to their small identity, which they want to preserve. They think it's disappearing, dissolving.
Sure. There are flags everywhere.
Yes, exactly. How to find this balance between?
Well, I've got a
making
very
it
strong
more-
Yorkshire memory, although I'm
making
actually
it
an
more-
immigrant to Yorkshire.
Yeah,
No,
but-
I'm not joking. I think that those kinds of identities can coexist. I don't think it's a problem, but I think sometimes it's a different memory. For example, I don't think really there's a Belgian memory, there's a Flemish memory, and there's a French-speaking Walloon memory. And they're different, and they're antagonistic.
This is the
and
country
they-
which lived without government for what, 6 months?
And it leaves without a government in Brussels, that's true. Well, except Brussels is a bit mixed, but no, that's true. But, what the point I'm making is that those different memories can still coexist within a larger frame. So, I mean, for example, I don't think that, and I think that was one of the reasons why the Irish problem almost solved itself, because it was understood that those different Irish identities could exist within Europe. They didn't have to be part of the United Kingdom or Great Britain. They could be part of something else. So that other inclusiveness allowed, a more comfortable sense of Irish or Northern Irish identity. And it's amazing how that has evolved so quickly, really. These things don't usually happen that quickly, but it has. So I think there is a way in which those smaller identities can live. I mean, I had my summer trip with the family to Denmark, and everywhere the flags, and very proud of everything. They speak perfect English, but they're extraordinarily, and so they should be, because it's a wonderful country. But I mean, there is that sense that we are not going to be anything but Danish.
Exactly. So there are, that's why we had the situation in Norway this summer.
So, yeah, I mean, I hope that I'm over-optimistic, but I hope that one can reconcile those, those very vital local identities with a larger. I think the problem is, though, that still the history is segregated. I mean, still we have the idea of segregating the dead, and segregating the various memorial sites, and not truly having that beyond the nation sense, and that is still problematic, I think. But maybe it's a question whether Croats have to go through being very Croat before there's something else. I don't know.
I think Europe still should negotiate what does it mean to be European. It's just the beginning of this. So
Let's start with the Greeks.
or Italians and now Spanish, yeah. And,
I think there is a way in which...
Honestly, I do believe that memory is a very strong part of this renegotiation of European identity.
Absolutely, yeah. But I mean, I grew up playing with Italian prisoners of war, just brought back from Italy, from North Africa in '43, and then hanging out with German prisoners of war in 1945, and later on going back to visit their families in Germany. So, there was a minority of people in Britain who grew up with a very strong inclination to be Europeans. And I think that sometimes you forget that. Yeah, they're not in government usually, and they don't run the newspapers, but there is a very strong, and I certainly have that feeling of being, although I spent almost half my life in the United States, but nevertheless I have that sense of being more European than British. And I think that people forget that a little bit.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.